Right, got the right talk this time. I'm just going to be talking today about the development and calibration of a process-based forest growth model called 3PG-SonWal, which I've been working with. Just for context, so I work on the NetZeroPlus project, leading the modelling work with 3PG under work package 2.3. But as Danny mentioned, I'm going to be working a little bit with some of the AdTrees researchers, which I'll delve into a little bit later on. So just an overview of the talk I'm just going to give today. So I'll just touch upon scientific background and then delve into 3PG-SonWal, which is the forest growth model that I've been working with, how we've developed it to better represent drought, some model calibration for specific species and individual sites, and then the development of a UK spatial framework so we can run the model across the whole of the UK, and then future work, so alluding into some of the mixed species model development that we're hoping to do. So forest management cycles from planting to growing to felling typically occur over time periods of 40 to 100 years. And so this means that species suitability for commercial forestry requires quite long-term thinking. And so in order to inform sustainable land management decisions, it's really important that we incorporate future climate risks and uncertainty analysis into the decision support tools that we provide to forest managers, policymakers, practitioners. So, for example, an increase in the frequency and severity of drought under future climate change may pose a long-term risk to forest productivity in the UK. But often the process-based models that kind of drive the management and species suitability lack sensitivity to hydrological water deficits. And this means that they are unable to accurately quantify the impacts of drought on forest growth. And so our research question is looking into how well can a process-based forest model with improved sensitivity drought predict forest yields under different climate change scenarios. So this involves development of 3PG to improve its sensitivity to drought. And then we've calibrated the model for some particular sites for Sitka spruce and Scots pine as productive conifer species, and then development for deciduous species such as oak, looking at our more native woodland. And then we're assessing the ability of our models to capture historic growth under climate data, and then assessing the spatial variability of forest productivity across Great Britain under current and future climate scenarios. So just a little bit about 3PG and its structure. So 3PG is a forest growth model based on physiological processes predicting growth, hence the 3Ps and the G. And it's a stand level growth model that can be applied to plantations, homogeneous, even aged forest stands. And so 3PG is a direct attempt to bridge the gap between your more conventional mensuration of growth field models and then the more complex fully coupled carbon cycle models. So we call it a hybrid model where it's process-based, but we have some allometric equations to derive certain stand attributes such as height. And the inputs to the model are relatively easy accessible site and climate data. And then the main attributes of the model include predicting biomass production. The model then allocates this biomass between the stem, leaves, and root system, simulates the soil-water balance, stem mortality, and then stand attributes which may be useful for foresters or assessing greenhouse gas removal. And so in the original version of the model, the soil was just represented by a single layer model with evaporation. And how the forest responds to environmental change is determined by these environmental modifiers which limit growth. And so here these are just based on things like vapor pressure deficit, temperature, frost days, water availability, age, and nutrition of nutrients in the soil. And so in order to better capture the impacts of drought and soil nutrition on growth, we have developed 3PG to a version that we call 3PG-SonWal. This just stands for soil nutrition and water availability. Might be asking you guys for some better names later on. So yeah, essentially in this version of the model, we've maintained all the key above ground components of 3PG, but introduced a new soil hydrological model. And so the key developments here are highlighted in this graphic. So first, we've divided the soil profile into a rooting and non-rooting zone. Here, the rooting zone is essentially derived from the biomass of the roots as predicted by the model. So as the tree grows and the roots grow, this soil profile changes. And then it's just the available soil water in this root zone that determines the impacts of water availability on the forest growth. Soil drainage and runoff is now derived using field capacity and soil saturation points. The evaporation in the soil is now like a two-step process whereby once the top layer of the soil dries out, that acts as a bit of a barrier to further evaporation, so just to stop a bit of a runaway effect there. And then in addition, we've also added a soil organic matter decomposition model. And so this model represents and partitions different pools of carbon and nitrogen in the soil. And then it takes inputs from leaf litter as the forest grows and drops leaves, and then inputs that into the soil carbon and nitrogen. And then this allows us to introduce a fertility rating, so how the nutrition affects growth, that varies over the life of the stand. Whereas in the previous version, you just kind of set the fertility based on what you think the kind of soil quality is. And so in order to calibrate the model to better reflect the unique growth characteristics and dynamics of specific sites and species, we employ a Markov chain Monte Carlo MCMC calibration. And this is a Bayesian statistical method used to estimate uncertain model parameters. And so to identify our uncertain model parameters, we undertake a Morris sensitivity screening. And so this essentially evaluates the different parameters and how much influence they have on the model sensitivity. So yeah, this graph here is just showing the output from this. And probably can't really see this very well, but the higher the bars, the more sensitive the model is to those parameters. Usually these parameters relate to biomass partitioning, stand properties and soil data. And so once we've obtained our uncertain parameters, we then, to undertake the calibration, we identify their likely values. And this is either based on our physical understanding of the system, information from previous calibrations, and that describes our prior distribution. Then we obtain measurement data, so long-term eddy covariance flux measurements is really great for calibrating our model alongside growth measurements and soil measurements. And then we determine a likelihood function, which just tells the algorithm how well the model matches the measurement data. And then the calibration essentially runs different chains and iteratively samples different parameter sets, and then evaluates how well they match the measurement data. And then our posterior distribution then reflects our updated belief about model parameters based on our prior knowledge and our measurement data. So here just showing some output from 9 model parameters. So the blue showing our prior, so what we believed about the parameters before, and then the pink is showing the updated belief. And what's really useful about this is it allows us to run our model with like a median value, and then also explore the uncertainty in that parameter estimation. And so we've applied this calibration to calibrate the model for Sitka spruce, here using the high quality greenhouse gas measurement data from Harwood, which is a site up in Northumberland. And yeah, so we've got a really high quality data set of flux measurements, like leaf litter traps, and soils data. And yeah, the graph here is just showing some of the different fluxes. The purple line is showing our median modelled output. The orange bands that up to 90 and 10th percentiles, and then the black dots just mean monthly output. So you can see the top left, GPP, so gross primary production, soil water content. And so you can see following the calibration, the model does a pretty good job at representing the historical fluxes at the Harwood site. And so I guess under the Net Zero project, where we're wanting to predict forest growth across the whole of the UK, we undertook a second stage of calibration for the Sitka data, here to try and reduce the site-specific bias. So here we extended the calibration using diameter data taken from 13 dendrochronology samples across the UK. So yeah, when I say dendro sample, we essentially take a tree core and then you estimate the tree ring width from that section of the tree to derive annual growth increments. We've also applied the calibration to calibrate the model for Scots pine. So here we've taken advantage of the online available FluxNet measurement data. So here for a site in Finland. And yeah, again, able to quite well kind of represent the growth dynamics there. So with our fluxes such as gross primary productivity, and then some of the leaf area index and diameter down at the bottom. And yeah, we've also set up the model to represent deciduous species. So here representing leaf phenology, or the growing season in the trees. And yeah, here we've taken advantage of measurement data from an oak woodland in Alice Holt in the south of England. And again, we've just been setting up the model, calibrating it to the historical measurement data here. And similar with the Sitka data, we're going to extend the calibration a bit more widely, just using some dendro data that we're hopefully going to get hold of soon from this large campaign that went to 28 different broadleaf sites across the UK and is assessing growth impacts under drought. So hopefully that'll be a really useful data set for us to further calibrate the model to. And so we've developed a UK spatial framework. So this allows us to explore tree growth under future climate change. So here we can run 3PG on 1 kilometre grid squares using the downscaled regional chest climate data. And so yeah, we've taken our climate and soils data, and then we obtain our parameters from our MCMC calibration. Here we take a sample of 500 of these parameters from where the models converged, and then run 3PG across the whole of the UK. And this allows us to predict growth and also the uncertainty in the parameters across the UK. And so here is just output from just a very crude simulation where I essentially took over the whole of Great Britain, planted Scots pine, and just ran it forward under RCP 6.0. On the left is just showing 11 years down the line, and then this plot, I think 50 or 60 years down the line. So you can just see how the kind of model predicts growth over the whole of the UK, just taking into account the climate and the soils data. And so, yeah, there's a growing body of evidence that suggests that mixed species forests offer a greater resilience to natural disturbances, so they're better equipped to cope with shocks from climate, pests and diseases. They can also help us achieve multiple policy objectives, so biodiversity restoration, greenhouse gas removal, improving soil quality, and recreational and economic value. However, there's a lack of process-based models that represent mixed species stands, and this really limits our understanding of mixed woodlands' role in greenhouse gas removal. In order to represent mixed forests in process-based models, we need to consider lots of key factors. So one being complex growth dynamics. So in a mixed species forest, you've got different species which will have different growth rates, different nutrient requirements, different canopy structures. So an oak versus like a pine. And so a model will need to represent how different species grow together over time, how they might interact with each other and the environment. There's also competition and complementary effects. So obviously different species in a stand will be competing for resources like light, water, nutrients. But there's also some complementary effects which could help enhance ecosystem productivity. So here we could have some forests that fix the nitrogen that could help another species, or a species might protect another from wind damage. So we need to try and account for these competition and complementary effects. And also, if we believe that mixed species stands are more resilient to environmental change, we need to try and quantify how a mixed species stand will respond to certain environmental shocks. And so in model world, I guess a mixed species forest doesn't quite look as pretty. But yeah, essentially here we'd be introducing vertical heterogeneity into our model so that we could represent either an uneven age stand or two different species, with different heights. And then, in terms of model enhancements, I've just split them up into above ground and below ground compartments. So in terms of the above ground components, we could develop a light absorption routine, which will integrate a kind of vertical difference between canopy layers. So you get a lot of sunlight absorption for the more dominant of the taller trees, and then this will change in the layer below. We'd also introduce vertical gradients in climate variables within the canopy, so change in aerodynamic conductivity, vapor pressure deficit. And we also want to be able to predict the standard distributions of the different species, so we're able to account for their greenhouse gas removal or growth. Now the below ground, so we'd expect that different tree species would compete differently in a mixed stand for resources like water and nutrients. And it's also likely that they would behave differently under stresses such as low water availability. So this below ground aspect is probably going to be quite a challenge. It's something that's not really measured, especially in mixed species stands. And the kind of soil type often is a larger driver of behaviour. So that'll be kind of something that we really need to look into and figure out how best to represent. And so under the NetZero Flexible Fund, we're hoping to implement a mixed species version of 3PG-SonWal. Here we're going to take advantage of Forest Research Silvicultural Experiment Database, which has a bunch of different mixed species studies. And predominantly, as we're based in forestry, they're the above ground growth and yield measurements. And so we'll be working with some of the AdTrees teams to set up and calibrate the model for different species mixtures using this observation data. And in a first instance, we'll assume that both species have the kind of same access to the water and soil nutrients below ground, which is something that we could maybe develop down the line. But I guess, as I mentioned, there's still quite a lot of uncertainty around there. And then once we have 3PG-SonWal set up and working for different species mixes, so just some examples here, we can then apply the model to explore the growth patterns of different species mixes. And then the aim is to integrate these into the NetZeroPlus decision support tools, where a user can define and explore different proportions of species mix, and from this explore outputs such as carbon sequestration or other important outputs for growth. And then here's just showing a bit of a kind of dummy data where we'd have two species, so beech and pine, and then we could explore kind of how their growth changes over time. And yeah, so in summary, we've updated 3PG to better represent soil hydrology and nutrition. And yeah, over the next coming months, we're going to be developing the model to represent uneven aged and mixed species stands. And yeah, with the aim of integrating this into the NetZeroPlus Add Trees decision support tools to try give a bit of information into mixed species planting portfolios. And yeah, finished a bit.